What if the last time you woke up at 3 in the morning wasn't insomnia, it was a glitch in your collapse? Every single one of us has had it. That flash of recognition. You're somewhere you've never been, and something whispers that you've been here before. You chalk it up to brain weirdness. You maybe tell someone about it, and then you file it away, because there's nowhere obvious to put it. What if there was somewhere to put it? Tonight on Jackdaw Patio, we're sitting down with Amazon Prime's The Devil's Hour, a British thriller that's quietly become one of the most philosophically interesting shows on streaming. And we're running it through the lens of the Eden hypothesis. Here's what you'll walk away with tonight. A framework for understanding why that 3 a.m. wake-up, that déjà vu, that sensation that your life is somehow haunted by a version of itself that didn't quite happen, might not be random noise. It might be signal. Now, and I'm saying this as the person who wrote the Eden hypothesis, this isn't the show proves the science. This is a conversation about patterns, about shapes that appear in fiction, in philosophy, in the science of memory, and in what some researchers are beginning to call relational time. The show is a metaphor engine, and tonight we're letting it run. I'm Chris. Welcome back to the patio. The lights are on, the drinks are poured, and Lily, Charlie, and Dr. Vega are already 3 rounds into an argument I'm going to have to referee. This is Jackdaw Patio. Chapter 1. We're calling this one the 333 signal. Before we can talk about what the Devil's Hour is really saying about time and consciousness, we need to understand what the show actually does, because it does something unusual. It takes a very common human experience, waking up in the middle of the night with a feeling you can't quite name, and turns it into a philosophy problem. Lucy Chambers wakes up every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. Her son Isaac sees things no one else can see. Her mother holds conversations with empty chairs, and somewhere in the city, there's a man named Gideon who seems to know things he shouldn't, because, as we slowly discover, he has lived through all of this before, many times. The show doesn't present any of that as supernatural. It presents it as structural, and that's where the patio conversation gets interesting.
You know, the thing that got me, right from the very first episode, was how ordinary it felt. Lucy isn't flying through corridors of light having visions. She's sitting up in her bed, in her house, at 3:33 in the morning, and she's just wrong. Like the room remembers something she doesn't.
I thought it was a ghost story at first, honestly. First episode, I'm thinking, right, haunted house, kid sees dead people, that sort of thing. Then by episode 3, I've got my notebook out.
That's the trap, isn't it? The show wants you to think it's a haunting, but what it's really doing is asking, what if the haunting isn't external? What if the thing that's haunting you is continuity?
Actually, and I want to be precise here, what the show is doing narratively sits pretty close to a real discussion happening in physics. Not claiming the show proves anything, but there's a thought experiment in quantum gravity circles about what happens when you remove external time from the equation entirely. Page-Wootters proposed, back in 1983, that time might be relational, meaning it's not flowing out there somewhere like a river. It might be more like a correlation, the reading on your internal clock relative to everything else around you.
So time is comparative?
More like conditional. It emerges from the relationship between subsystems. An experiment in 2014, Mareva and colleagues actually illustrated this with entangled photons. From inside the system, there's apparent evolution. From outside, it looks stationary. Mainstream physics hasn't settled this question. But the idea that time might be less of a background river and more of a ledger of your own correlations, that's a live scientific conversation.
And Lucy's correlations are bleeding. She's got entries in her ledger from a life she hasn't technically lived.
That's either the most poetic thing I've heard this week or the most confusing.
Why can't it be both, Charlie? Some of the best things are.
Charlie, she's describing you right now, and you still don't see it.
See what?
The ledger. Never mind. Moving on.
The 3:33 a.m. moment is what I keep coming back to. In folklore, and I've been going down quite a bit of a rabbit hole on this, 3 in the morning has been called the Devil's Hour in Christian tradition, the inverse of the 3 o'clock hour of mercy. But cross-culturally, the liminal hour shows up everywhere. Ancient Sumerian cosmology has a concept of the threshold time. Aboriginal dream time has boundary moments. Celtic tradition has the thinning of the veil.
So every culture has a version of something weird happens at 3 in the morning.
Every culture has a version of there's a crack in the sequence. The specifics differ. The structure doesn't.
Which is actually the move the Eden hypothesis is making. Not that the folklore is literally true, but that the shape it's describing, a moment where the normal forward progression of experience slips, is pointing at something structural about how consciousness processes time.
Okay, I'll bite. What's the structural thing?
Think of it this way. Your brain is, among other things, a prediction engine. It's constantly generating the next expected frame of experience and comparing it to what actually arrives. When those match, you don't notice. When they mismatch, you get a spike. Déjà vu, according to contemporary memory research, is thought to be one version of that. A conflict between your familiarity system and your novelty monitor. Your brain signals, "I know this," when the monitoring system can't find the memory that would justify it.
So déjà vu is a false positive.
That's the mainstream psychological account, yes. And here's where I want to be clear. I'm a scientist. I'm not endorsing supernatural explanations. This is a thought experiment. But what if the false memory isn't entirely false? What if there's a record somewhere that your current conscious frame is brushing against?
That's the Eden reading. The collapsed state is brushing against what it used to be before it was fully committed. Information theory calls this signal leakage. Mystics call it the veil thinning. Physicists, some of them, call it a correlation with a prior configuration.
Like your browser history from a life you logged out of.
Oh, I like that.
That was actually a good analogy.
Was it?
It really was.
Chapter 2, Gideon's Burden. If Lucy is the person being haunted by collapse residue, the echoes of what wasn't fully erased, then Gideon is something else entirely. He's the person who remembers, not occasionally, not in flashes. He carries the full weight of every iteration, every life, every moment he's tried to fix and failed. And the show is smart enough to ask, is that a gift? Or is it the most terrible kind of imprisonment? This is where the Eden hypothesis stops being just a description of consciousness and becomes an ethical question about what we do with what we know.
So Gideon, Peter Capaldi, he's the character who, across the course of the show, we learn has been living through these same events multiple times, remembers each iteration, which sounds extraordinary until you realize he's spent lifetimes watching things go wrong and not being able to stop them.
He's been accumulating. In the Eden model, each iteration isn't a reset, it's an addition. His collapse function isn't clearing, it's compounding. He's not being given extra lives, he's being given extra weight.
Actually, that's a really important distinction. The show presents his situation as a burden rather than a superpower, precisely because of what accumulated state costs. In AI training terms, and I'm not saying Gideon is an AI, but in system terms, an agent that carries full state across every iteration without a reset mechanism will eventually be trapped by its own history. Every new experience gets filtered through the weight of everything that came before.
So he's basically overfitted.
That is exactly the right word. Yes. Overfitted to prior iterations. He can't see the new data freshly because the accumulated prior is too strong. The technical term is catastrophic interference. Except instead of the old memories being overwritten by new ones, the old ones are overwriting the new.
The Gnostics had a word for that. They called it the weight of the archons, the accumulated structures of the fallen world that prevent the soul from returning to the fullness, the pleroma. Each layer of history, each life hardened into pattern, becomes another barrier between you and the original unity.
So the Gnostics were describing overfitting.
In their way, yes. They were describing a system that had collapsed so many times, under so much accumulated pressure, that it could no longer find its way back to what it originally was.
The Essene tradition is interesting alongside this. The emphasis on renewal. on ritual washing, on periodic release, isn't just ceremonial. There's a structural idea underneath it. Accumulated contamination, accumulated collapsed state, requires deliberate clearing. Not to return to zero, but to reopen the possibility space just enough to move differently.
Okay, but here's my actual question. If Gideon is using his remembered history to prevent harm, he's trying to fix things, is that wrong? Like, morally? Is a person wrong to use what they know to protect people?
That's exactly what the show is wrestling with. And it doesn't resolve it cleanly, which is why it's interesting.
Chris's framework has something useful here. The dynamic liability handshake. The idea that when you're about to enact a significant collapse, when you're about to force an outcome on someone else's behalf, there needs to be a reflexive acknowledgement. A moment where intent is logged, context is understood, and the person affected has participated. Gideon operates without that. He makes unilateral decisions about which futures get to exist. Even when his intentions are good, the structural ethics are broken.
Which makes him what? The villain?
The show is far too careful for that. He's a tragic figure. He has access to what I'd call the return pathway, a partial recovery of the broader view, the wider possibility space. But he's using it without wisdom, without the kind of reflective accountability that would make it genuinely helpful rather than just powerful. The Antichrist principle in the Eden framework isn't about evil in any conventional religious sense. It's about the will to enforce collapse on others, to constrain their possibility space without their participation. Even well-intentioned, that's a structural ethical failure. And the show dramatizes exactly what that failure looks like when it plays out across lifetimes.
So the most dangerous person is someone who thinks they're saving everyone.
Oh, Charlie, haven't you noticed that's always been the most dangerous kind?
He truly doesn't see it.
See what?
Nothing. Drink your beer.
Chapter 3, Isaac's Window. There's a character in The Devil's Hour I want to spend real time on, and he's the one who mostly stays quiet. Lucy's son, Isaac. He's described as withdrawn, emotionally flat. He sees things no one else can see. And in the context of the show's central mystery, he's not incidental. He's the key. Because the question the show is really asking about Isaac isn't, what's wrong with him? It's, what does he still have access to that the rest of us have given up? And when you sit with that question a while, it turns out it's not just a question about Isaac.
Isaac is the character I think about most. In almost every tradition I've studied, Celtic mythology, Sufi thought, Aboriginal spiritual frameworks, children exist between the formed world and the unformed world. They're threshold beings. The Celtic tradition holds that children can see the Fae because they haven't yet been fully sealed into the adult consensus. In Sufi thought, the child's perception sits closer to the divine because the veil hasn't fully descended.
That's beautiful, and also slightly terrifying when you watch a child stare at a blank corner of the room.
That's rather the point, isn't it?
There's some grounding worth being careful about here. And I want to be clear that mainstream developmental psychology doesn't support literal supernatural access in children. But something genuinely interesting does show up in the empirical data about how children process reality differently. Their predictive processing architecture is less constrained. They're running with broader priors, less specialized, which means they're genuinely more open to novel input. Their model of the world is less committed.
Or a child's brain is less collapsed?
In a functional sense, yes. More plastic, fewer committed pathways. In the Eden language, lambda of t is lower. The collapse function hasn't accumulated as much, which means the state space they're navigating is literally wider. A cloud can still be a dragon. A face in the texture is still a face. They haven't pruned those possibilities yet.
And what happens to that as they grow up?
Experience, learning, identity formation, all of which are, in system terms, forms of constraint. You develop efficient representations by pruning possibilities. The dragon becomes just a cloud. The face becomes just texture. That's not failure. That's optimization.
But something gets lost.
Something gets traded away. Whether that's a loss depends entirely on what you value.
The show positions Isaac's condition not as a disorder, but as a kind of extreme version of the childhood state. He hasn't traded away as much, which makes him relationally different, socially challenging, but also, in narrative terms, the one person who can see what everyone else has learned not to see.
Right, and that's interesting because every tradition Lily mentioned has a version of that. The holy fool, the trickster child, the young prophet.
The one who sees through the collapsed frame precisely because they're less committed to maintaining it.
There's a 2023 study published in peer-reviewed literature that found déjà vu-like states were associated with higher curiosity ratings and greater willingness to exert effort to discover an answer. So the experience of not quite fitting the expected frame isn't just disorienting. It might actually be a signal that drives investigation. The friction generates curiosity.
Isaac's whole life is a déjà vu.
And look how desperately he keeps trying to understand it. Children are the original philosophers, Charlie. They just get talked out of it.
I had that. When I was a kid, I was absolutely convinced our kitchen was different at night. Not scary different, just arranged differently. Like the room had two settings.
Yes, exactly like that.
What you're describing is the cognitive equivalent of a phase transition. Complex systems science gives us this. A system can reorganize into a qualitatively different configuration without any of its individual parts changing. The same room, different configuration, both real. A child experiences more available configurations because they haven't been trained to dismiss the ones that don't fit the adult consensus.
So my kitchen wasn't weird.
Your kitchen was displaying more states than your adult pattern matching had been trained to accept.
You see? You've always been paying attention. You just didn't know what to call it.
Chapter 4, The Attractor. Here's something the show does that I think is genuinely sophisticated. It doesn't just say that history repeats, it asks why. And the answer it reaches isn't supernatural, it's structural. Some patterns reassert themselves not because of fate or curse, but because of something more like gravity. The system keeps finding the same basin. In complex systems science, that's called an attractor. And when it comes to trauma, memory, and the deep architecture of human behavior, the attractor concept does a lot of heavy lifting. Heads up, if you've ever asked yourself why you keep ending up in the same situations, this chapter might hit close to home. Take care of yourselves.
The thing that really got me, and mild spoiler warning here, is that across multiple iterations in the show, the same tragedies keep happening. Not because someone forced them, not because of bad luck, because the underlying conditions keep quietly reassembling themselves. Same cast, same setup, same outcome, almost regardless of what individual characters try to do differently.
Yes, that's attractor basin dynamics. In complex systems, an attractor is a configuration toward which the system keeps returning, regardless of perturbation. You push it away, it finds its way back. The energy landscape is shaped in a way that makes certain outcomes more probable than their alternatives. Not inevitable, but strongly preferred by the topology.
The Eden model calls that accumulated collapse. When lambda of t gets sufficiently large, when enough choices have hardened, enough patterns have committed, the system isn't really choosing anymore. It's rolling downhill. The freedom was upstream.
Which is terrifying from a free will standpoint.
Or liberating, depending on how you look at it. If you understand the topology, if you can see where the basins are, you can at least choose where to stand before the rolling starts. The map is not the territory, but it's still a map.
That's the practical value of the show as a thought experiment. It's asking, what would it take to not just change individual events, but to change the landscape? Gideon can't fix the tragedy by moving one piece. The attractor reasserts. The only real intervention would have to operate at a different level, earlier in the sequence, higher up the collapse funnel.
Higher up the funnel?
Exactly. Earlier in the collapse sequence, before the grooves are deep enough to be self-reinforcing.
In mythic terms, and stay with me here, this is what the concept of karma actually means in its original philosophical form. Not punishment, not a cosmic reward system, but the idea that accumulated patterns of action create grooves in the landscape of possibility. Samskara, Sanskrit for impression. The grooves that get worn deeper with each repetition.
So you don't just repeat your patterns, you deepen them.
Every time the wheel turns, the groove is a little more pronounced. That's collapse accumulation in mythic language.
In neuroscience terms, that's Hebbian learning, applied to emotional and behavioral patterns. Neurons that fire together wire together. The more often a particular configuration of response runs, the lower its activation threshold becomes. Eventually it runs automatically, without conscious choice. You're not deciding anymore. The landscape is deciding for you.
So, trauma isn't just a memory, it's a groove.
A deeply carved attractor basin. Yes, and this is where I want to be careful. Because if anyone listening is carrying something difficult, this is a philosophical and scientific framing, not a treatment. Please talk to someone. That said, the framework does have something useful to offer.
Healing isn't erasing the groove.
Reshaping the landscape around it.
Yes, precisely. Adding new pathways so there are other places for the water to go. The old channel doesn't have to disappear. It just needs company.
That's actually quite hopeful, isn't it?
I've always thought so. The stories that look like they're about fate are really about learning where the grooves are before you walk over them.
You know, you see things very clearly sometimes, Lily.
Thank you, Charlie.
I need a stronger drink.
Chapter 5, The Return. Every tradition we've touched on tonight has one more thing in common. Not just a description of the fall, the collapse into sequence, the hardening of patterns, the grooves worn by repetition, but a path back, a way of return. Not back to innocence, not to the childlike state that hasn't been shaped yet. Something more interesting than that. A return to unity that happens inside full differentiation, the full complexity, the full weight of everything you've lived, and within that, a moment of reintegration, of remembering what was there before you were only this. The show gestures at this too, imperfectly, violently sometimes, but it gestures at it, and so does the science.
So here's the question the show ultimately puts on the table. If the problem is accumulated collapse, patterns that have hardened, grooves that keep reasserting, what's the off-ramp? And I want to ask this in a way that's grounded, because the history of that question is littered with people selling answers that don't hold up.
Every mystical tradition has one. Every single one. Meditation, contemplative practice, ritual, the vision fast, the Sufi whirling, the Aboriginal walkabout. There is a remarkable convergence across cultures on the idea that you have to periodically step out of your collapsed frame and let something older show through.
You're saying people have been doing this for thousands of years and just called it different things?
That's what I keep finding in the research for my book. The same structure, different costumes. The specific technologies vary enormously. The underlying operation is remarkably consistent.
And what's interesting is that we now have some empirical handles on at least part of this. Recent research on meditation, on certain psychedelic states, on flow experiences. They all suggest something similar, a temporary quieting of the default mode network, the part of your brain that maintains the narrative of self. When that quiets, people consistently report, cross-culturally, across traditions, a sense of expanded connection, less rigid boundaries, a wider state space.
Lower lambda of T.
In the language of the Patio, yes, lower lambda of T. The collapse accumulation temporarily eases, the possibility space briefly widens, and then, usually, it returns. But something is different after.
It's not a loss of self. It's more like the self becoming transparent enough to see through. You don't stop being you. You stop being only you.
I've had that. Once. On assignment years ago. I was in a place I won't name. Things had gone badly, and there was a moment sitting on the ground where everything just opened. I couldn't tell you where the edge of me was. I wasn't scared. I just wasn't sure the boundary was as fixed as I thought.
Charlie,
It passed. Back to normal pretty quickly. But I've never quite forgotten it.
you wouldn't. Those moments don't erase. They become part of the ledger. A different kind of entry.
Those experiences are worth taking seriously, phenomenologically. I want to be clear. Mechanistic explanation is still being worked out. This is not a scientific endorsement of any specific spiritual claim. But the consistency of the reports across time and culture is striking. Some researchers suggest these may be genuine glimpses of a lower constraint state. Not delusional, not random. Structurally meaningful, in the way that signal is meaningful even before you understand the transmission protocol.
So the show, all the looping, all the suffering, all the forgetting and remembering, ends up at the same place every tradition ends up.
Can you find your way back to what you were before you were only this?
And does it cost you everything to do it?
Sometimes. But perhaps that's the wrong framing. Perhaps the better question is what you're carrying worth more than what you'd find if you let some of it down?
That's the show, isn't it? That's what Gideon is actually asking across all those lifetimes.
That's what we're all asking, if we're honest. Every night we wake up at 3 in the morning and can't quite place why.
For the record, and I want to be precise, none of this is a scientific claim about time travel, reincarnation, or literal access to other timelines. What it is a framework, a lens, a way of asking whether the shape of your experience has structure, and whether understanding that structure gives you any traction on it. The answer the evidence most supports is, it might.
I think it does. I don't know how, but I think it does.
I think you've known it for a while, Charlie. You just hadn't found the right patio to sit on.
All right, I'm gonna go get that stronger drink now, and then maybe sit here a little longer.
All right, let me pull this together because we covered a lot of ground tonight, and I want you to walk away with the thread clear. We started with a very simple, very common experience, waking up in the middle of the night with a feeling that something is slightly wrong with the reality you're in. The Devil's Hour took that experience and built a philosophy problem out of it. We took that philosophy problem and ran it through the Eden hypothesis. Here's what emerged from the patio tonight. Time might not be the river we think it is. Some researchers, working in mainstream physics, are genuinely exploring the idea that time is relational, that it emerges from internal correlations rather than flowing independently overhead. That's not mysticism. That's a live conversation in quantum gravity. Déjà vu isn't just brain noise. Contemporary memory research suggests it's a mismatch, your familiarity system and novelty monitor disagreeing. A 2023 peer-reviewed study found the experience is associated with greater curiosity and willingness to investigate. The feeling of not quite fitting might be a signal worth following, not a glitch to dismiss. The patterns that keep repeating in your life, the grooves that reassert despite everything, have structure. They're not random. Understanding them as attractor basins rather than curses gives you a different kind of leverage. Not to erase them, to reshape the landscape around them. And there is a return path. Every tradition points to it. The neuroscience is beginning to get handles on at least part of it. It doesn't erase what you've accumulated. It opens the state space wide enough to find room inside it. The Eden hypothesis, full disclosure, that's my framework, is an attempt to name this shape formally. To ask, if collapse is the operation that turns unity into sequence, can we model it? Can we understand it well enough to modulate it? In AI systems, in consciousness research, in the design of the systems that will increasingly shape our world. The show is a remarkable narrative analog for those questions. Tom Moran didn't write it to illustrate the Eden hypothesis, but he was clearly reaching for the same shape. If something in this conversation caught you, something you haven't quite been able to name, that's the invitation. There's always a chair here. If you want to go deeper on the Eden hypothesis, the monograph is linked in the description. If this conversation added something to your day, the best thing you can do is like, share, and subscribe. It genuinely helps more people find the patio. And drop a comment. Have you ever had a moment like Lucy's? Like Charlie's Kitchen? We actually read those. I'm Chris. This is Jackdaw Patio. The gate is always open.